The world had shrunk to the cracked screen of my phone, each tiny fracture a roadmap of my own shattered life. My thumb, slick with a mixture of tears and condensation from a bottle of cheap Merlot, hovered over the send button. The words I'd typed were a jumbled, incoherent monument to heartbreak, a long, rambling confession of pain addressed to a number I thought was his, Mark's number. I detailed every lie, every dollar of debt he'd saddled me with, every promise he'd broken before leaving me for someone else. The apartment around me was a disaster zone, mirroring my insides. A picture frame of us, smiling, lay shattered on the floor, its glass crunching under my bare feet whenever I moved. The air was thick with the sour smell of spilled wine and the suffocating scent of betrayal. My finger trembled, a tiny earthquake of grief and rage. It was a stupid, desperate act, a scream into the digital void, but it was all I had left. I just wanted him to know the depth of the wreckage he'd caused. With a final, guttural sob that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside, I pressed down, sending my pathetic eulogy for our dead relationship out into the unforgiving night. The moment the little blue bubble confirmed delivered, a wave of icy regret washed over me, even colder than the grief. What had I done? Laying my soul bare for a man who had already proven he would just step on it. It was pathetic. I was pathetic. For a moment, the weight of it all, the staggering student loans for a design degree I'd abandoned to support his dreams, the credit card debt he'd racked up in my name for his gambling, the hollowed-out feeling of being so utterly disposable threatened to drown me right there on my stained apartment floor. You know that feeling, don't you? That gut-wrenching moment you do something so impulsive, so utterly self-destructive that you can't even breathe for a second. If you've ever felt that bottom-of-the-barrel despair, or if you're just morbidly curious to see how much worse my night could possibly get, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and maybe give this video a like. Your support means the world, and trust me, this story is just getting started. I threw the phone across the room, watching it skid under the dusty couch, wishing I could disappear with it. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator and the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. I curled into a ball, trying to make myself as small as possible, as if I could shrink away from the consequences of my own foolishness. Then, a faint buzz echoed from under the couch. It buzzed again, insistent. Against my better judgment, I crawled on my hands and knees, my palms sticking to the grimy floor, and retrieved the device. The screen was lit up with a notification from an unknown number. It wasn't Mark. My blood ran cold. Who had I sent that novel of despair to? A stranger? My mind raced through the humiliating possibilities. An old boss, a distant relative, some random person who now had a front row seat to my complete and total meltdown. With trembling fingers, I opened the message, bracing for mockery or a simple wrong number. But the reply wasn't what I expected. It was short, direct, and devoid of any emotion I could decipher. Just 6 words that somehow carried the weight of an order. Come here. I'll help you forget him. Below it was an address, a sleek, minimalist pin dropped in the city's most exclusive, intimidating district. Logic screamed at me to block the number, to throw the phone against the wall again, this time hard enough. It was insane. A stranger, a cryptic command, an address in a part of town where a single cocktail cost more than my entire waitress uniform. This had all the makings of a horror story, the kind you hear about on the news where the naive girl makes one last fatal mistake. Yet something else was stirring inside me, something darker and more reckless than logic. What did I have left to lose? My dignity was already in shreds, my heart was a crater, and my bank account was a cruel joke. The idea of forgetting, even for a single night, was a siren song I was too weak to resist. The message wasn't kind or gentle. It was commanding, almost arrogant, and that was strangely compelling. It wasn't pity. It was a challenge. So I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I stood up, splashed cold water on my tear-stained face, pulled on the only clean dress I owned, a simple black sheath from my restaurant job, and walked out into the cold, unforgiving city to meet a complete and dangerous mystery. The address led to a place called the Silencio, an establishment with no sign, just a heavy, unmarked black door and a single imposing man standing beside it who nodded me in without a word. The inside was the complete opposite of my chaotic life. It was all dark wood, polished chrome, and deep plush leather booths, bathed in a low, golden light. The air was still and smelled of expensive whiskey and something else, something like power. It was quiet, almost reverently so, with only the soft clinking of ice and heavy crystal glasses breaking the silence. I felt instantly out of place, a stray dog that had wandered into a lion's den. My cheap dress felt like a costume, my scuffed shoes a declaration of my otherness. I scanned the room, my heart hammering against my ribs, until my eyes landed on him. He was sitting alone in the most secluded booth, and I knew instantly it was him. He wasn't looking at his phone or the door, he was just watching the room with a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt display of strength. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his dark hair impeccably styled, and his face was a mask of cold, handsome neutrality. He raised his chin slightly, a silent summons. As I slid into the booth across from him, I felt the sheer force of his presence. It was like sitting too close to a dormant volcano. He didn't smile or offer a greeting. His eyes, a shade of gray as stormy as the night sky, assessed me with an unnerving intensity, as if he were cataloging every one of my flaws and fears. "You're Lena," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate through the leather seat. It wasn't a question. He slid a glass of water across the polished table toward me. "Drink." I obeyed without thinking, my hand shaking slightly. He didn't ask about the text, about Mark, about the tears. He just watched me, his silence a heavy blanket. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, him perfectly composed, me a bundle of exposed nerves. I didn't understand what was happening, what he wanted. Finally, I found my voice, a weak, reedy thing. "Who are you?" He took a slow sip of his own drink, something dark in a heavy tumbler, his gaze never leaving mine. "I'm the man who owns this building, this block, and the answer to a mistake you made." His response explained nothing and everything all at once, leaving me more terrified and confused than when I'd arrived. After another 10 minutes of his unnerving, silent scrutiny, I couldn't take it anymore. I mumbled a thank you for the water and slid out of the booth, my legs feeling like jelly. He didn't try to stop me. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if dismissing me. I felt like a fool. I had come all this way for what? To be stared at by a handsome, terrifying stranger in a silent bar? The humiliation burned hotter than the grief. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped not onto the main street, but into a narrow, rain-slicked back alley that served as a service exit. The cold air was a shock to my system. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head, when two figures detached themselves from the shadows by the dumpsters. My heart leaped into my throat. Before I could scream, one of them grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Well, well," he sneered, his breath hot and smelling of stale cigarettes. The other man circled me, his eyes cold and predatory. Dante doesn't usually let his girls wander off alone. He must be getting soft. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dante's girl? My drunken text, my one stupid, desperate mistake, had just thrown me into a war I didn't even know existed. My breath hitched, the metallic tang of fear flooding my mouth, as the alley seemed to shrink around me. The two men were shadows with teeth, their cruel laughter echoing off the wet brick walls. One of them, the one with the cigarette breath, tightened his grip on my arm, and I could feel the distinct, sickening shape of his knuckles pressing into my bone. "Dante's girl," the other one repeated, circling me like a vulture. "Ivan will pay a lot to have a little chat with you." My mind was a blank slate of terror. Who was Dante? Who was Ivan? This was a nightmare spawned from a single stupid text message. Just as the first man began to drag me deeper into the darkness, a shape detached itself from the doorway of the silencio. It was him, Dante. He moved with an unnatural speed and silence, not a predator, but something more final, like an executioner. He didn't shout or run. He simply appeared beside the man holding me, and in one fluid motion, there was a sickening crunch of bone. The man's grip vanished as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The second man froze, his eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed my own, before turning to run. He didn't get 2 steps before Dante's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall with a force that seemed impossible. I stood there paralyzed as Dante leaned in close to the terrified man pinned against the brick. His voice was a low, lethal whisper, each word a shard of ice. "You will go back to Ivan Petrov," he murmured, his tone devoid of any emotion, "and you will tell him that what belongs to me stays mine. You will tell him that the next time he sends his dogs to my door, I will not send them back breathing." He then released the man, who scrambled away into the night like a frightened rat. Dante didn't even watch him go. He turned his attention back to me, his stormy gray eyes sweeping over my trembling form, checking for injuries with a detached, clinical intensity. He straightened my dress collar, his touch surprisingly gentle yet utterly impersonal, before taking my elbow in a firm, non-negotiable grip. "We're leaving," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a suggestion. He steered me toward a sleek black car that had materialized at the end of the alley, its engine a low, menacing purr. I was too stunned to resist, my legs moving on autopilot as he bundled me into the passenger seat. The heavy car door clicked shut, sealing me inside a world of leather, silence, and a danger so profound it felt like I was suffocating. The ride was silent, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon and gold as we moved through the streets with an unnerving speed. We didn't go back to the front of the bar, but instead ascended through a private underground garage, ending up in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float among the clouds. It was a palace of glass and steel, minimalist and cold, a stark, sterile world away from the cluttered, emotional chaos of my own small apartment. The moment the elevator doors opened directly into the living space, I found my voice. "Where am I? What is going on?" I demanded, spinning to face him as he calmly removed his suit jacket. "Who was that man? Ivan? Why do they think I'm yours?" He walked over to a vast window that overlooked the entire glittering city, a king surveying his domain. He didn't look at me when he finally spoke, his reflection a ghostly image in the glass. "You sent a message to a number I used once for a single conversation with Ivan Petrov. He believes you are my weakness, a secret I was hiding. By answering you, by bringing you to my bar, I confirmed his suspicion. In his world, a woman is either a possession or a liability. He now sees you as both." The finality in his tone was crushing. My one desperate, drunken mistake hadn't just been embarrassing, it had painted a target on my back. The next 48 hours were a blur of escalating dread. The world I knew began to crumble with terrifying speed. First came the call from my manager at the restaurant. I was fired. Apparently, some valued patrons had complained about my unprofessional associates causing a disturbance in the alley. It was a flimsy excuse, and I knew it. The real reason was fear. Dante owned the restaurant, and someone was sending him a message through me. Then came the eviction notice, taped to my door, its bold red letters screaming that I had 3 days to pay 2 months of back rent or be out on the street. The final blow came in the form of Mark, my ex, showing up at my door, his face pale and sweaty. He wasn't there to apologize. He was there to beg for money, whispering about the men he owed, men who didn't make idle threats. He said they'd been asking about me, asking where I worked, who I was seeing. He had led them right to me. Every pillar of my life, my job, my home, my past, was collapsing, and I was buried in the rubble, completely and utterly alone with the consequences of his betrayal and my own foolish despair. I was stuffing my few valuable possessions into a cardboard box, tears of sheer, helpless rage streaming down my face, when a sharp knock echoed through the thin apartment door. My heart hammered against my ribs, convinced it was the men Mark had been so terrified of. I froze, holding my breath, but the knock came again, patient and firm. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peehole, my blood ran cold. It was Dante. He was standing in the dingy, poorly lit hallway of my building, looking as out of place as a panther in a petting zoo. I opened the door a crack, my body language screaming for him to leave. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer. His gaze moved past me, taking in the eviction notice still taped to the door, the pathetic cardboard boxes, the tear tracks on my face. A muscle in his jaw tightened, the only sign of the cold fury radiating from him. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at my situation with the focused outrage of an architect seeing a flaw in the universe that he was compelled to correct. He knew. Somehow, he knew everything, and that feeling of being so utterly exposed was almost worse than the fear. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive click that shut out the rest of the world. He moved through my tiny apartment, his presence so large it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He stopped in front of the shattered picture frame of me and Mark, nudging a piece of glass with the toe of his expensive shoe. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low command. "You are a target because of me. You have no job, you are about to have no home, and your ex-boyfriend's cowardice has put a price on your head. These are the facts." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I didn't want his help, that this was his fault, but the words died in my throat. He was right. "I am offering you a solution," he continued, turning to face me, his gray eyes pinning me in place. "You will come with me. You will live in my home, where I can guarantee your safety. It is the only place in this city Ivan Petrov cannot touch you." The offer hung in the air, a lifeline made of chains. It was a gilded cage, a form of protection that felt terrifyingly like ownership, and every independent bone in my body screamed in protest. "No," I choked out, the word tasting like ash. "Absolutely not. I am not your prisoner. I'm not some project you can fix. I will not trade one kind of debt for another." My voice shook, but I stood my ground, fueled by a desperate surge of pride. "I'll figure it out. I'll go to the police. I'll leave the city. I'll do anything but become whatever it is you want me to be." Dante listened to my frantic outburst with an unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable. When I finally ran out of breath, he took a step closer, his proximity both threatening and strangely grounding. "The police cannot protect you from a man like Ivan," he stated, his voice calm and lethal. "And you are not a project. You are a loose thread in a tapestry I control. Leaving the city will only make you an easier target. You misunderstand my offer, Lena." He paused, his gaze so intense it felt like he could see right into my soul. "I don't own people. I protect what is mine. And whether you like it or not, the moment Petrov's men put their hands on you, you became mine to protect. This is not about what I want from you. This is about what I will not allow to happen to you." His words were a strange, terrifying mix of possession and principle, his moral code on full display. Just as I was about to argue again, to throw his twisted logic back in his face, a loud crash shattered the tense silence. The living room window exploded inward, sending a shower of glass across the floor. My scream was swallowed by the sudden chaos. Lying in the middle of the glittering shards was a brick, a piece of paper tied around it with dirty twine. My body went rigid with a fear so pure it was paralyzing. Dante, however, didn't even flinch. He moved with that same impossible speed I'd seen in the alley, positioning himself between me and the broken window, his body a solid shield. He calmly bent down, untied the note, and read it, his face a mask of stone. After a moment, he held it out for me to see. The message was crude, written in a messy scrawl. "We know where you sleep, little ghost. Give us the girl." The threat was no longer a vague possibility whispered in a dark alley. It was here, in my home, in the one place I was supposed to be safe. Dante said nothing. He didn't have to. The shattered window and the crude, terrifying note said it all. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My independence was an illusion that would get me killed. I stood there, trembling, looking at the wreckage of my life. The cheap particle board furniture I'd built with Mark, the faded rug, the pathetic boxes filled with the remnants of a future that had never existed. This wasn't a home. It was a cage of bad memories and broken promises. Staying here meant waiting for Ivan's men to come through the door instead of just the window. It meant facing down Mark's violent creditors alone. It meant disappearing into a world of fear and poverty from which there was no escape. Then I looked at Dante. He was a monster, a man who lived by a code of violence and control, a ghost who moved through the city's underbelly. But he was also the only person who had looked at my disaster and offered not pity, but a solution. A dangerous, terrifying, and absolute solution. It was a choice between a certain, ugly end and a deeply uncertain, perilous beginning. It was the choice to surrender the last piece of myself, my autonomy, in exchange for my life. My fight was gone, replaced by a cold, pragmatic understanding of my own powerlessness. I was drowning, and he was the only one offering a hand, even if I knew his grip would leave bruises. My shoulders slumped in defeat. I walked over to the single duffel bag I'd packed with my most essential belongings, a few changes of clothes, my mother's old locket, the sketchbook I hadn't opened in years. I zipped it shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. I turned back to Dante, my eyes meeting his across the room. I didn't need to see my reflection to know I looked broken, a pale, hollowed-out version of the woman I used to be. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a life-altering vow. "I'll go with you." A flicker of something, relief maybe, or resolve, passed through his stormy eyes before the mask of cold neutrality snapped back into place. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Marco is downstairs. He will take your bag." He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with purpose. "Leave everything else. Your old life is a liability we can no longer afford." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply walked to the door and held it open for me, a silent, unmovable sentinel, guarding the path to a world from which I knew with bone-deep certainty I would never truly be able to return. I took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold, leaving the ghost of Lena Petrova behind in the ruins. Life in Dante's penthouse was like living inside a diamond, beautiful, cold, and impossibly hard. The rules were established on that first night with the same chilling lack of emotion he applied to everything else. I was not to leave the apartment with Marco, his silent, ever-present shadow. My old phone was gone, replaced by a sleek, encrypted device that only had 2 contacts, his and Marco's. Every window was made of glass that could stop a bullet, and the elevator required a keycard and a fingerprint scan. He explained these were not suggestions, but conditions for my survival. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of being a prisoner in this gilded cage, but one look at his face, a mask of unyielding certainty, and the fight died in my throat. He wasn't being cruel, he was being practical, treating my life like a complex security problem he was uniquely qualified to solve. That first night, I didn't sleep. I just stood by the vast floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights glitter below like a galaxy of lost souls, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I was safe from Ivan Petrov, but I had a terrifying new warden. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of luxurious confinement. The apartment was a monument to sterile perfection, all clean lines, chrome, and shades of gray. A space so devoid of personal touches, it felt more like a high-end hotel suite than a home. It was a perfect reflection of the man who owned it. The only room that held any warmth was a library, its walls lined with thousands of books on art, history, and classical literature. It was a shocking contradiction, this hidden well of culture inside a man who dealt in violence. I would spend hours in there, running my fingers over the leather-bound spines, trying to piece together the puzzle of Dante Moretti. Marco was a constant, silent presence, always just out of my line of sight, polite but impenetrable. Dante himself was a ghost, coming and going at odd hours, his movements silent and purposeful. I felt a gnawing, frustrating curiosity about him, a dangerous desire to know the man beneath the perfectly tailored suits and the iron control. I tried to sketch in the notebook I'd brought, my one tangible link to my old self, but my hands were too unsteady, the lines coming out jagged and uncertain, a perfect portrait of my fractured state of mind. One night, long after the city had fallen into a hushed quiet, he found me in the library, staring blankly at a page in an art history book. I expected him to be annoyed, to tell me to go to bed, but instead, he walked over to the shelf and pulled down a different volume. "You were studying design," he stated, his low voice startling me in the silence. It wasn't a question. "What was your focus?" I was immediately defensive, my old insecurities flaring up. "Textile design, not that it matters now." I waited for the dismissal, the hint of judgment about a dream I'd abandoned. Instead, he opened the book he was holding to a page featuring a complex Renaissance tapestry. "You have a good eye for structure and color theory," he said, his gaze fixed on the image, not on me. "Look at the way the weaver used negative space to create tension." For a few minutes, he just talked about the art, his observations sharp and insightful. It was the first time he had spoken to me as a person with a mind and a history, not just a liability he was forced to protect. A tiny, confusing spark of warmth ignited in the cold emptiness of my chest, a flicker of connection I was terrified to feel. A few days later, that flicker was fanned by a gesture so unexpected it left me reeling. Frustrated by my own helplessness, I decided to try and make myself useful by cooking a meal in his ridiculously modern kitchen, which looked more like a science lab than a place for food. I fumbled with an unfamiliar vegetable slicer, and a moment of distraction was all it took. A sharp, searing pain shot up my finger, followed by the sight of crimson welling up from a deep cut. Before I could even react, he was there, moving with that silent, unnerving speed. He said nothing, simply took my hand in his grip firm and steady, and led me to the sink. He cleaned the wound with a detached, clinical efficiency, his touch surprisingly gentle. The intimacy of the act was staggering. His large, calloused thumb brushing against my palm sent a jolt through my entire body. He worked in complete silence, his focus entirely on the small injury, as if it were the most important task in the world. He bandaged my finger with practiced ease, his movements economical and precise. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and my skin tingling where he had touched me. The feeling of confinement began to eat away at me, the four walls of the penthouse pressing in until I felt I couldn't breathe. I cornered Marco one afternoon and demanded to go outside, even just for a few minutes. "I need fresh air," I pleaded, my voice tight with desperation. "I'm not a porcelain doll, I won't break." After a tense call to Dante, he reluctantly agreed, escorting me to a private rooftop garden, a manicured oasis of green in a sea of concrete and glass. The wind on my face was heaven. I felt a sliver of my old self return as I walked the perimeter, but the feeling was short-lived. My eyes caught a flicker of movement in the sky, a small black drone hovering just beyond the building's edge. My blood ran cold. "Marco?" I whispered, pointing. His face became a mask of cold fury. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising, and pulled me back toward the door without a word. Later that night, Dante confronted me, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That was reckless. You put yourself on display." I snapped back, my fear eclipsed by a surge of defiance. "I won't live in a cage. I need to feel the sun, to breathe. This isn't protection, it's a prison." It was our first real fight, a raw clash between his absolute need for control and my desperate, clawing need for freedom. The consequences of that drone sighting arrived 2 days later. A courier delivered a sleek black box to the building's front desk, addressed to me. Security protocol dictated that Marco intercept all packages, but he wasn't fast enough to stop me from seeing my name on the label, next to a chillingly simple inscription, "For Dante's ghost." Marco's body went rigid as he took the box, his jaw tight. He opened it carefully in the entryway, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a single, perfect white rose, its petals already starting to wilt at the edges. The meaning was lost on me, but not on Dante, who emerged from his office at the sound of our tense silence. He saw the rose, and for a terrifying split second, his mask of cold composure vanished. I saw a flash of such pure, murderous rage in his eyes that it made me physically recoil. It was the look of a predator whose territory had been violated. He slammed the box shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent apartment. He didn't explain what it meant, but the chilling atmosphere told me everything I needed to know. The danger wasn't just a vague threat anymore. It had found a way to cross his threshold and land right at my feet. The arrival of the white rose changed everything. The air in the penthouse, already tense, grew thick with a suffocating, unspoken suspicion. A package like that, a direct message from Ivan Petrov, couldn't have bypassed Dante's formidable security network without help from someone on the inside. There was a traitor in his organization. The realization settled over me like a shroud. I was no longer just a target. I was the catalyst for a weakness in his impenetrable fortress, the crack in the armor that his enemies were now exploiting. Dante became even more of a ghost, a phantom of controlled fury moving through the apartment. I would hear his voice, a low, lethal murmur, coming from his office at all hours of the night as he spoke on the phone in rapid Italian. I saw him in hushed, urgent conversations with Marco, their expressions grim, their shoulders tense. I felt like an intruder, a spectator to a silent, deadly play where I was the unwilling main character. The weight of my mistake, that one drunken, desperate text, felt heavier than ever. It hadn't just ruined my life, it was now threatening to dismantle his, and the guilt was a bitter, corrosive acid in my stomach. One night, unable to sleep, I found him standing by the massive window in the living room, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the city lights reflecting in his storming eyes. He looked different, not like the untouchable crime boss, but like a man carrying an impossible weight. The exhaustion was etched in the tense line of his jaw. On a reckless impulse, I walked over and stood beside him, following his gaze to the sprawling metropolis below. "Tell me about her," I whispered, the words leaving my lips before I could stop them. "Isabella." The name hung in the air between us, a fragile, dangerous thing. He didn't turn to look at me, but a muscle in his cheek twitched. For a long time, he was silent, and I was sure he would order me to leave. Instead, he spoke, his voice roughed with an emotion I couldn't name. "She trusted the wrong person. I was supposed to be there. I made a promise." He didn't elaborate, but in those few, clipped sentences, I saw it all. The crushing guilt, the failure that forged his rigid moral code. In that moment, he wasn't my captor or my protector. He was just a man, haunted by his own ghosts, and I saw a profound, aching reflection of my own broken trust in his eyes. The revelation of a traitor forced Dante's hand. He informed me we were moving, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This location is compromised. We leave in 10 minutes. Marco had 2 bags packed and waiting by the door. The efficiency of it all was terrifying. We descended in the private elevator to the underground garage, a cavern of concrete and shadows. We were halfway to the exit ramp, encased in the silent, armored shell of a black sedan, when the world exploded in a cacophony of violence. A heavy van slammed into our side, the screech of protesting metal deafening, followed by the percussive, deafening pop-pop-pop of automatic gunfire. The bulletproof windows crazed into a spiderweb of opaque fractures, but held. Marco, his face a grim mask, wrestled with the wheel, barking codes into a hidden microphone on his collar. Before I could even process the attack, Dante moved. In one fluid, powerful motion, he unbuckled and threw himself across my body, his weight a solid, living shield, pressing me down into the leather seat. Pinned beneath him, with the chaos raging outside and the solid, steady beat of his heart hammering against my ear, the last of my illusions shattered. This wasn't a shelter. It was the front line of a war, and I was standing right at its epicenter. The world outside the armored car was a symphony of destruction, a chaotic blend of screeching tires, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the dull thud of bullets impacting metal just inches from my head. Pinned beneath Dante's solid weight, I could feel the controlled tension in his muscles, the steady, unnervingly calm rhythm of his breathing against my cheek. He was a shield of living steel, and in that terrifying moment, all I could think was that my last sensation on Earth would be the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the acrid smell of cordite. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault shifted. Marco, with a guttural roar, rammed our vehicle forward, creating a momentary opening. Dante moved in a blur, pushing me further down as he drew a weapon from an ankle holster I never knew he had. The window beside him lowered a fraction of an inch, and he fired twice. 2 precise, economical shots that were answered by a sickening silence from one direction. The car lurched again, and we were speeding into the darkness of an underground tunnel, the sounds of the ambush fading behind us like a nightmare. He didn't move off me until the heavy steel gate of our destination slammed shut, plunging us into a secure, silent tomb. We had arrived at a different kind of prison, a sprawling, modern house nestled in the hills outside the city, a fortress of concrete and darkened glass that blended into the rocky landscape. The adrenaline that had kept me rigid during the attack drained away, leaving me a trembling, boneless wreck. Marco was on the phone, his voice a low, angry torrent of Italian, while Dante led me into a cavernous living room. I sank onto a plush sofa, wrapping my arms around myself, but the shaking wouldn't stop. He disappeared for a moment. The car lurched again, and we were speeding into the darkness of an underground tunnel, the sounds of the ambush fading behind us like a nightmare. He didn't move off me until the heavy steel gate of our destination slammed shut, plunging us into a secure, silent tomb. We had arrived at a different kind of prison, a sprawling, modern house nestled in the hills outside the city, a fortress of concrete and darkened glass that blended into the rocky landscape. The adrenaline that had kept me rigid during the attack drained away, leaving me a trembling, boneless wreck. Marco was on the phone, his voice a low, angry torrent of Italian, while Dante led me into a cavernous living room. I sank onto a plush sofa, wrapping my arms around myself, but the shaking wouldn't stop. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy cashmere blanket, which he draped over my shoulders without a word. His touch was brief, almost impersonal, yet the simple weight of the fabric was a profound comfort. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to me. "Drink," he commanded softly. "It will help." As I took a shaky sip, the burn of the liquid a welcome shock to my system, he stared into the unlit fireplace, his profile carved from stone. "This was a test," he said, his voice low and laced with a cold fury I'd never heard before, to see how far I would go, to see if I would break protocol for you. He had, and we both knew it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. He had broken his own rules, the rigid discipline that had kept him alive, and he had done it to shield me. The knowledge was a heavy, terrifying burden. "The white rose," I whispered, the memory of the wilted flower in the black box surfacing through my shock. What did it mean? He took a long swallow of his whiskey before answering, his gaze still fixed on the empty fireplace. "It was Ivan's signature. He left one for my sister, Isabella, the day before she died. It's a promise, a declaration that he intends to take something precious from his enemy." The words hung in the air, a confession of the failure that haunted him, the ghost that shaped his every action. In that moment, the vast, intimidating space between the powerful mafia boss and the broken waitress collapsed. We were just two people, bound by a shared language of loss and betrayal, each of us marked by a promise someone else had failed to keep. The world he inhabited was infinitely more violent than mine, but the shape of the wound, the hollow ache of being unable to protect someone you love, was terrifyingly familiar to me. He finally turned to face me, his stormy gray eyes searching my face, and the air in the room grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the violence we had just survived. He took a step closer, his presence an overwhelming force that drew all the oxygen toward him. My heart, which had just begun to slow its frantic pace, hammered against my ribs for an entirely different reason. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from a strand of hair that had fallen across my cheek. I could feel the heat radiating from his hand, a silent promise of a touch that could either save me or shatter me completely. For a split second, the mask of control slipped, and I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, a flicker of longing, a deep, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. The mask was back in place, the moment gone, leaving behind an unspoken tension so powerful it was almost a physical thing. He had built his entire world on a foundation of control, and I was the one variable that threatened to bring it all crashing down. The next few days in the secluded safe house were a strange purgatory. Marco had doubled the security, and the property was a silent, humming hive of quiet, watchful men. The attack had proven that Ivan Petrov was not just testing the waters anymore. He was launching an all-out assault, and I was the designated battlefield. One afternoon, Marco entered the room where I was sketching, his face grim. "We have a problem," he announced, his voice low. "Petrov's men picked up your ex-boyfriend, Mark." A shard of ice pierced through my chest. Mark, the weak, spineless source of all this misery, was now in their hands. Dante entered the room behind Marco, having clearly already heard the news. "He's a coward," Dante stated, his tone laced with contempt. "He will tell them everything he knows for a bottle of cheap vodka and a promise they won't break his legs." He was right. Mark would give them my entire life story, my mother's address, my favorite coffee shop, every secret I'd ever told him. Ivan wasn't just targeting the woman Dante was protecting, he was digging into the life of Lena Petrova, searching for a weakness he could exploit, a personal history he could twist into a weapon. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the reality of my situation crashing down on me with the force of a physical blow. I was a disease, a plague I had brought into Dante's fortress, and everyone he was sworn to protect was now at risk because of me. The guilt was a suffocating weight, a poison seeping into my very bones. Before I could talk myself out of it, I slipped out of bed, my mind made up. I would not be the reason he fell. I would not be another Isabella, another ghost to haunt his conscience. I scribbled a hasty note. "I'm sorry, this is the only way to keep you safe," and left it on my pillow. Dressed in clothes I'd found in the closet, I crept through the silent house, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve. I managed to bypass the first two guards and was fumbling with the lock on a service door that led to the woods when a hand closed around my arm. It wasn't rough, but the grip was absolute. I turned to see Dante standing behind me, his face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, his expression not angry, but utterly devastated. "Don't," he whispered, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual authority. "Don't do this." He pulled me away from the door, turning me to face him, his hands gripping my shoulders. I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines of a man pushed to his absolute limit. I scribbled a hasty note, "I'm sorry, this is the only way to keep you safe," and left it on my pillow. Dressed in clothes I'd found in the closet, I crept through the silent house, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve. I managed to bypass the first 2 guards and was fumbling with the lock on a service door that led to the woods when a hand closed around my arm. It wasn't rough, but the grip was absolute. I turned to see Dante standing behind me, his face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, his expression not angry, but utterly devastated. "Don't," he whispered, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual authority. "Don't do this." He pulled me away from the door, turning me to face him, his hands gripping my shoulders. I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines of a man pushed to his absolute limit. "You think leaving protects me?" he asked, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't name. "Lena, you walking out that door? That is the only thing that could destroy me. For 10 years, I have built an empire of stone and silence to keep myself from feeling anything. I protect things, not people. It's cleaner. But you are not a liability. You are the only thing that has felt real in a decade." His confession hung in the silent hallway, a fragile, terrifying truth. "Your safety is not my duty," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his gaze so intense it burned. "It's the only thing I care about. Don't take that from me. Don't make me lose you, too." In that moment, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was a man begging me not to become another ghost in a life already full of them. My resolve crumbled, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it stole my breath. I sagged against him, and his arms came around me, holding me tightly, his chin resting on the top of my head. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or control. It was the desperate, grounding embrace of 2 people clinging to a life raft in a storm. We stood like that for a long time, the silent house a witness to our unspoken vow. I wasn't his prisoner anymore, and he wasn't just my protector. We were in this together, bound by a connection forged in fear and tempered by a shared, desperate need for something real. When he finally pulled back, he kept one of his hands intertwined with mine, his thumb stroking the back of my hand, in a gesture of quiet reassurance. In that moment, I made my choice. I would not run. I would stay and fight, not just for my own survival, but for his. Just as that fragile peace settled over us, Marco appeared at the end of the hall, his face pale. He was holding a tablet, and he turned the screen toward us. It was a live feed, a grainy, shaky video of Mark, bruised and terrified. But what made my blood run cold was what the camera panned to next. My mother's locket, dangling from Ivan Petrov's fingers. The world dissolved into the grainy pixels on the tablet screen, shrinking until it was nothing but the glint of silver from my mother's locket, held between Ivan Petrov's thumb and forefinger. A cold, silent dread washed over me, so absolute it felt like drowning. I waited for Dante to explode, to rage, to put his fist through a wall. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He went perfectly still. The warmth that had begun to seep into his stormy gray eyes was extinguished, replaced by the flat, merciless void of a winter sky. He became the ghost, a creature of pure, cold calculation. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the sob that tore from my throat. His attention was fixed on the screen, his mind already 3 steps ahead in a lethal chess match I couldn't comprehend. "Marco," he said, his voice a low, deadly monotone that cut through the air. Scrub our digital footprint for the last 12 hours. Find the origin of that feed. I want every man we have on the street. Now." He turned and walked toward his office without a backward glance, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click that echoed the sound of my heart breaking. He had built a wall around me to keep the world out, but in that moment, he had locked me on the outside of it, alone with the crushing guilt of knowing I was the weapon that had finally breached his defenses. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Dante's entire organization, a silent, sprawling empire I had only glimpsed, pivoted with the terrifying efficiency of a predator sensing blood. Every resource, every loyal soldier was redirected to the singular task of finding Mark and retrieving a small silver locket. But Ivan Petrov was a master of his own dark craft, and he had anticipated this. He knew that by focusing all of Dante's power on one sentimental target, he was leaving the rest of his kingdom exposed. The call came in the dead of night. I was huddled in the living room, unable to sleep, when I heard Dante's voice from his office, a low, guttural stream of furious Italian. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of loss, of a flank being crushed. Later, a grim-faced associate informed him that a warehouse in the Port District, a key distribution hub for his legitimate businesses, had been hit. Worse, Marco, who had been leading the search party for Mark, had driven into a sophisticated ambush. He was alive, but 2 of his men were dead, and his arm had been shattered by a sniper's bullet. Every piece of bad news was a fresh indictment of my presence, another crack in the foundation of his world caused by the sheer, catastrophic weight of my existence. In the suffocating silence that followed the news of Marco's injury, Dante locked himself away, consumed by a darkness that seemed to radiate through the walls of his office. He was hunting, not just for Petrov, but for the ghost of his own past failures. Late one evening, driven by a desperate need to do something, anything, I brought him a cup of coffee. The door was ajar, and I saw him hunched over his desk, not looking at surveillance feeds, but at an old, yellowed file. It was Isabella's. He didn't notice me as he read, his face a mask of dawning horror. I heard him whisper a name, not Petrov's, but that of a cousin, a man I knew from a photograph in the library had been dead for years. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The betrayal that had led to his sister's death hadn't come from an enemy. It had come from within his own family, a weakness Petrov had exploited even then. Dante's entire moral code, his obsessive vendetta, was built on a lie. He had punished the wrong people, avenged the wrong crime. He looked up then and saw me, and his eyes were not those of a protector, but of a man completely and utterly lost, his own certainty shattered into a million pieces. The ground beneath his feet had vanished, and I was the one who had led him to the edge of the abyss. My guilt was a physical entity, a cold, heavy thing that sat in my chest and made it hard to breathe. I felt like a carrier of a plague, infecting and destroying everything I touched. I went to see Marco, who was recovering in a secure medical suite within the house. He was pale, his arm bound in a complex cast, but he still managed a weak, reassuring smile for me. "Not your fault, Lena," he said, his voice strained. "This is the life we chose." But his words offered no comfort. As I left his room, I overheard 2 guards talking in the hallway, their voices low and urgent. "He's losing control," one of them murmured. "This girl, she's his sister all over again. Petrov knows it. He's not just attacking the business, he's dismantling the man." The other guard nodded grimly. "She's the ghost's ghost." The phrase struck me with the force of a physical blow. That's what I was, a haunting, a living reminder of his greatest failure, a weakness his enemy could see even if he couldn't. I was not a person to be protected. I was a vulnerability to be managed. And my very presence was unraveling the cold, precise control that had kept him alive for so long. To save him, I knew I had to exile myself from his life, no matter the cost. The breaking point came when Dante, hollowed out by his grief and the shattering of his past, made a decision born of pure, cold desperation. His surveillance team finally got a lock on Mark's location, a derelict warehouse on the city's industrial outskirts. But it was too obvious, too clean. It was a trap. I listened, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, as he laid out the plan to his most trusted men. He wasn't going to rescue Mark. He was going to let Petrov move him, let him think his bait had been taken, and then he was going to hit the entire convoy with overwhelming force, leveling the warehouse if he had to. Mark is a casualty, he stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. He is the price for ending this. I stepped out of the shadows then, my heart a block of ice. No, I whispered, my voice shaking. You can't just sacrifice him. He turned to me, his face a mask of stone. This is not your world, Lena, he said, the words a final, brutal dismissal. You don't get to have an opinion on how I keep you safe. In that moment, he wasn't my protector. He was a monster, willing to burn down the world to honor a promise. And I finally understood that I wasn't just in danger from Ivan Petrov. I was in danger of losing the man I was beginning to love to the darkness inside him. I could not be the reason he sacrificed his soul. I would not stand by and watch him become the very thing he fought against. My love for him, a fragile, terrifying thing that had grown in the dark, demanded that I protect him from himself. Back in my room, I took the encrypted phone he had given me, the symbol of my gilded cage, and turned it into a key. My fingers trembled as I composed the message, not to Dante, but to a ghost from his past, a contact from the old burner phone data that I prayed Petrov was still monitoring. The words were simple, a declaration of surrender. Stop. It ends now. I'll trade myself for Mark and the locket, unarmed, alone. Tell me where. I pressed send before my courage could fail me. The little blue bubble a confirmation of my own death sentence. Then I wrote a short note to Dante and left it on the pillow where he had sometimes watched me sleep. It wasn't an apology this time. It was a release. You can't protect me from what you're becoming, I wrote. I won't be your ghost. Let me go. I walked out of the fortress then, not as a prisoner escaping, but as a soldier marching towards a battle I knew I couldn't win, armed only with the desperate hope that my sacrifice would be enough to save him. Dante found the note first, the few stark words a more devastating blow than any bullet. Then Marco, his face ashen, brought him the phone, the sent message displayed on the screen like an epitaph. He didn't rage. He didn't scream. A profound, terrifying silence filled the room as he stared at the screen, at the proof of what he saw as my ultimate betrayal. But beneath the anger was a current of soul-crushing terror. I hadn't run from him. I had run toward the enemy. I had taken his protection, his control, his entire world, and rendered it meaningless with a single, selfless, suicidal act. On the main monitor in his office, a tiny green dot blinked, tracking my movement as I walked through the city streets, a lamb heading to the slaughter. He was trapped, caught in the jaws of Petrov's masterfully designed snare. If he sent his men after me, they would be walking into a massacre. If he went himself, he would be giving his enemy the one thing he truly wanted. He didn't rage. He didn't scream. A profound, terrifying silence filled the room as he stared at the screen, at the proof of what he saw as my ultimate betrayal. But beneath the anger was a current of soul-crushing terror. I hadn't run from him. I had run toward the enemy. I had taken his protection, his control, his entire world, and rendered it meaningless with a single, selfless, suicidal act. On the main monitor in his office, a tiny green dot blinked, tracking my movement as I walked through the city streets, a lamb heading to the slaughter. He was trapped, caught in the jaws of Petrov's masterfully designed snare. If he sent his men after me, they would be walking into a massacre. If he went himself, he would be giving his enemy the one thing he truly wanted. If he did nothing, he would have to watch the blinking green light that represented his entire heart go dark. He was the most powerful man in the city, a king in a fortress of his own making, and he was utterly, completely helpless, left alone with the chilling certainty that he was about to lose me, not to his enemy, but to his own damn promise. The air in the abandoned shipyard was thick with the smell of rust and salt, a cold, damp shroud that clung to my skin. Two of Petrov's men, silent and imposing, flanked me as we walked toward a cavernous warehouse, its corrugated metal walls weeping with condensation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive quiet, but my fear was overlaid with a strange, chilling sense of purpose. This was my choice, my sacrifice. When they pushed me inside, the first thing I saw was Mark, tied to a chair, his face a swollen, pathetic mess of bruises and terror. He looked at me, and his eyes held not gratitude, but a shallow, pleading fear for himself. Any lingering pity I had for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was not here to save him. I was here to end the chain of destruction he had started. I straightened my shoulders, my gaze sweeping over the vast shadowed space, memorizing every exit, every stack of crates, every potential weapon. I would not be a passive victim waiting for slaughter. I was a pawn, yes, but even a pawn can reach the other side of the board and become a queen. The thought was a small, defiant spark in the suffocating darkness. Ivan Petrov emerged from the shadows, a predator in a bespoke suit, his smile a flash of white in the gloom. He moved with a languid, confident grace that made my skin crawl. In his hand, he held my mother's locket, swinging it gently back and forth like a hypnotist's watch. "Lena Petrova," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. "The ghost's ghost. He has a type, it seems. Beautiful, broken things he thinks he can fix." He circled me, his eyes cataloging my fear, feeding on it. "He failed with his sister. He will fail with you. It is the fatal flaw in his design, this sentimental need to protect the wounded. It makes him predictable. It makes him weak." I refused to flinch, holding his gaze, forcing my breathing to remain steady. I could see the narrative he had constructed, the story he told himself about his great rival. It was all about Dante. I was just a prop. And in that realization, I found my weapon. His obsession was a blind spot. He thought he was playing chess with Dante, but he didn't realize I was on the board, and I wasn't playing by his rules. My fear began to recede, replaced by a dangerous, razor-sharp clarity. I wasn't the prize. I was the trap. "You're wrong," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, cutting through his monologue. "You think this is about me? You think he's coming for a waitress he barely knows?" I took a deliberate step closer, forcing him to halt his circling. "He knows about the betrayal, the one that killed Isabella. He's known for years. He let you believe you were the mastermind, the great Ivan Petrov who outsmarted the ghost. But you were just a tool, a blunt instrument used by his own family to clean up a mess." Petrov's smug expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. I pressed my advantage, my words a torrent of calculated fiction built on the single grain of truth I'd seen in Dante's office. "He's not coming here to save me. He's coming here to finish what he started 10 years ago. He's coming for the man who signed his sister's death warrant, and you just led him right to the door. You're not the hunter, Ivan. You've always been the bait." A muscle in his jaw twitched. The seed of paranoia was planted. He glanced at his own men, a new suspicion dawning on his face. The master manipulator was losing control of his own narrative, and the air in the warehouse crackled with a new, volatile tension. Just as Petrov's face contorted with a mixture of rage and doubt, the world outside erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. It wasn't the thunderous assault I had imagined, but something far more insidious. A series of synchronized, percussive bangs echoed from all sides of the warehouse, followed by the shattering of the high windows. The main lights flickered and died, plunging us into a disorienting gloom, pierced only by strobing emergency beacons that cast long, dancing shadows. It was Dante. This wasn't a brute force rescue. It was a psychological dismantling, an attack designed to amplify the paranoia I had just created. Petrov screamed orders, but his men were already in disarray, unsure if the attack was coming from outside or from within their own ranks. In the confusion, I moved. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a nearby workbench and slammed it against the ropes binding Mark's hands. "Move," I hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling his terrified, stumbling form toward a dark service corridor I had noted earlier. He was dead weight, a liability, but I couldn't leave him. Dante's code, his refusal to harm the weak, had somehow become my own. We were a team, even when we were miles apart. As I shoved Mark into the relative darkness of the corridor, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom at the far end. My heart seized, the wrench held high, ready to swing. But then the strobe light flashed across his face, and a wave of relief so powerful it buckled my knees washed over me. It was Dante. He moved toward us with that impossible, silent grace, his face a mask of cold fury. But his eyes, his stormy gray eyes, were fixed on me, and in their depths I saw a raw, unguarded terror that mirrored my own. He didn't stop to ask if I was okay. He didn't lecture me. He simply reached into the holster at the small of his back and pressed a cold, heavy pistol into my hand, his fingers closing over mine for a brief, searing moment. "The corridor behind me leads out. Marco is there," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Don't let anyone follow." He was not putting me behind him. He was placing me at his back. He was trusting me to be his shield. In that single, breathtaking gesture, he erased every last vestige of the broken, disposable woman I thought I was. I was no longer a liability to be protected. I was his partner. I stood my ground at the mouth of the corridor, the unfamiliar weight of the gun a terrifying, solid reality in my hands, listening as Dante became the ghost he was named for. There was a brief, violent crescendo of noise from the main floor, shouts, the splintering of wood, a single, definitive gunshot, and then an echoing silence that was more profound than the chaos that preceded it. A few minutes later, he emerged from the smoke, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He walked past the neutralized guards without a glance, his entire focus on me. He stopped in front of me, his gaze dropping to the gun I still held with white-knuckled intensity, then to Mark, who was weeping silently against the wall. He gently took the weapon from my hands, his touch lingering, a silent question and a statement of fact all at once. "It's done," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He looked around at the wreckage of Petrov's ambition and my own desperation, and then his eyes met mine, holding a promise of something I never thought I'd have. "Come on," he whispered, taking my hand. "Let's go home." And for the first time, the word didn't sound like a place, but like a person. The months that followed the storm were not silent, but quiet, a different kind of quiet than the sterile, watchful hush of the penthouse. This was a peace earned through fire, a calm that settled deep in your bones. We never went back to the glass tower in the sky. Instead, the fortress in the hills became our home, its concrete and bulletproof windows slowly softened by the things I began to fill it with. Overflowing bookshelves, pots of unruly herbs in the kitchen, and the scent of paint from the studio Dante had built for me in a spare room. Ivan Petrov's name became a ghost, his empire absorbed or dismantled with the same ruthless efficiency Dante applied to everything. As for Mark, he was given a one-way ticket to a different continent and a bank account with enough money to disappear forever, a quiet act of mercy that was more Dante's than mine. Dante himself began to change, the hard edges of the ghost softening. He still moved with that coiled stillness, but he smiled more, a small, rare thing that was reserved only for me. He started coming home before the sun had fully set, and we would eat dinner together, the silence between us no longer a weapon or a shield, but a comfortable shared language. My own world began to expand beyond the four walls of our sanctuary. One evening, Dante laid a set of blueprints on the large oak table in the library. They were for the Silencio, the bar where our worlds had first collided. It had been shuttered since the night of the alley attack. "It's a dead space," he said, his voice neutral. "It holds a bad memory. I was going to sell it." He paused, his gray eyes watching me carefully. "But I thought perhaps you might have a better idea." It wasn't a test, it was an offering, a piece of his world placed gently in my hands. I spent the next 6 months consumed by the project, not just redesigning the space, but rebuilding it from the ground up. I tore down the dark wood and oppressive leather, replacing it with warm lighting, soft textures, and an open, airy layout. I renamed it Aria. Marco, his arm fully healed, would stop by the construction site, his initial suspicion of me long replaced by a gruff, brotherly affection. He'd nod at my changes, a rare smile touching his lips. "It's good," he'd say. He needed this, some light. I wasn't just redecorating a room, I was building a bridge between his world and mine, a place where we could both belong. The grand opening of Aria was a collision of two universes. Dante's men, in their sharp suits, stood like silent sentinels around the perimeter. But inside, the space was filled with the laughter and chatter of the city's artists and food critics I had personally invited. It was a testament to the new life we were building, a place where his power provided a foundation of safety for my creativity to flourish. Late in the evening, Dante pulled me away from the crowd and onto a small, private balcony overlooking the city. He didn't say a word, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart stopped. Inside wasn't a diamond, but my mother's locket, the silver polished to a brilliant shine, the clasp repaired, the tiny dent on its surface still there, a reminder of the journey. He had kept it all this time. "Everything that is mine, I protect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he fastened it around my neck. "And you, Lena, are the only thing that has ever truly been mine." It wasn't a claim of ownership, but a vow of devotion, a final, perfect closing of the circle that had begun with a desperate, drunken text message. Now, my days begin not with the echo of fear, but with the soft morning light filtering into our kitchen. I sit at the table, my sketchbook open, the lines flowing from my pencil with a confidence I thought I'd lost forever. The world outside these walls is still what it is, a place of shadows and sharp edges, but it no longer touches us here. Dante comes up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder as he looks down at the design taking shape on the page. We don't need many words. We have built a life in the quiet spaces, a home in the shelter of each other's arms. He is still a dangerous man, a ghost to his enemies, but to me, he is just Dante, the man who answered a call for help from a stranger, and, in saving me, found a way to save himself. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here, for listening to our story. Your support allows us to share these moments of hope, proving that even after the deepest heartbreak, it's possible to find a love that feels like coming home.